Welcome all to our digital week at Design and Mental Health. We're going to kick off the day. It's 2 o'clock now for our slot, and I've got a few others with me, Rosemary Jensen and Mark Carter. But first of all, just give you a few heads up in terms of some of the technical things. You'll see within the workcast there is a chat function. If you have a question for any of the presenters that you would like to ask along the way, then just simply enter the question in, and if you can start the sentence with a question mark, we'll know that it's a question that you want to be asked at the Q&A section at the end. So, sector resilience and top 10 tips. Well, 2020 is turning out to be quite a year. I had to be reminded the other day that the mass fires in Australia actually happened in 2020. We then had protests in Hong Kong, Greta Thunberg's fight against climate change, COVID, and more recently, in recent days, the Black Lives Matters movement. So you kind of have to wonder what's next. We've still got 6 and a bit months to go. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce our 3 speakers today. First up, we've got Rosemary Jensen. Having had over 20 years experience in delivering exemplar healthcare projects, in 2012, Rosemary set up her own practice providing independent healthcare design advice, supporting complex refurbs right through to major new builds, a number of those being award-winning. Rosemary has an active role on the Procure 22 framework, leading the efficiency and productivity programme, and taking on the pre and post occupancy evaluations, working with design and mental health to reevaluate these and redesign these for mental health facilities. Oops, I've just realised I'm not sharing my screen whilst I'm doing that, so bear with me. You'll not see my face now, but you'll actually see something of interest. Now we've got, next up is Mark Carter. Mark is one of the partners at Ryder, specialising in the delivery of healthcare projects. He's been involved in the design of healthcare schemes for over 25 years, with vast experience in mental health design for a range of service users, most recently with Serena CAMS in Cornwall and the upcoming Camden and Islington rebuild at Highgate in North London. And then also myself, I originally started Safe Inch Primera in 2009, all with a kind of passion for making people's lives better through good design. The company has evolved over the years, and our main focus is now within the mental health sector, designing products that empower patients, preserve their dignity, and help staff keep them safe. In 2013, I was at a Design and Mental Health board meeting, or an AGM, and put my hand up to join the board, and never looked back. Over the past 5 years, the main focus at my time at the board has been actually working with BRE and over 100 experts in the field to create a testing guide for products used within mental health. So that's the 3 speakers today on sector resilience, and without further ado, I'm going to stop my screen sharing and hand over to Rosemary. So, Rosemary, if I can ask you to take over here.
Can you see that okay?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us, everyone. I think Philip's really given a bit of background in terms of who I am and what I do. I wear many hats professionally and in my sort of hobby and pastimes as well. Primarily, I act, as Philip said, as an independent healthcare design advisor. I'm a healthcare architect by training and background. I lead a number of areas under Procure 22, under the Efficiency and Productivity Programme. And part of that also includes representing the framework on the Future Standards Working Group, which is the group responsible for rewriting the updates to health building notes and health technical memoranda. And most recently, I've also been an active participant in the P22 COVID-19 PMO, which is really their response to the requirements under this sort of current pandemic. I also undertake research and analysis, as Philip said, focusing very much on pre and post occupancy evaluations and working closely with the network. And I guess all of this is around assessing risk at pace, and having looked at some of my pastimes, maybe there's a bit of a theme there in terms of the things that I enjoy doing. So I guess there are lots of Benjamin Franklin quotes. There's nothing so permanent as a temporary arrangement, but there's really struck a chord at the moment in terms of out of adversity comes opportunity. And I think that's probably where we are at the moment. Nobody knows what the new normal might be or whether it will ever be normal in those terms. So what we're trying to do is really just gather our initial thoughts in terms of what the top 10 areas of impact may be moving forward and how we can provide resilience within the mental health sector in terms of primarily the built environment. So, top of the list really is I see this as a real opportunity to press the reset button. The World Economic Forum launched what they call the Great Reset last week, and it's really an opportunity to rebuild in a different way. The green reset in terms of the environmental, the economic reset, the work reset, and of course the public sector reset. And we've heard a lot of that recently. So in my view, this reset is about, it's no longer acceptable to compromise when it comes to mental health sector investment, strategy, and development. So my top 10 tips, they're all there. I'll just try and cover the top few in the time I've got available. But this is my personal view, supported by 25 years of specialising in mental health care in terms of design and 11 weeks into COVID lockdown in a rural area within Oxfordshire. And I'm aware we all have different experiences and views on the impact of COVID. So this is very much my personal one. It is an informed view. I've been at the heart of the COVID-19 response, working really closely with Public Health England, NHS England and NHS Improvement, as well as the Procure 22 framework, and really combining forces to better support trusts who are working and delivering services on the front line during this pandemic. So these are my top 10 thoughts to support the mental health sector resilience. As Philip's already mentioned, there are some headlines. It seems that 2020 has been all about COVID-19, but actually at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020, there were other global and national issues and crises. My first two, top of the list really, are remembering those headlines in terms of the CQC report, the Health Service Journal and national press exclusive recognising the appalling state that some of the mental health environments were in and some of the condition of the wards. So I've tried to pull together some statistics. 40% of all mental health trusts in England currently still have a proportion of dormitory style accommodation. Now, if you add to that the appalling environmental statistic around COVID-19, if we assume 95% bed occupancy, this means that over 1,000 service users are today receiving treatment and care in England with no more safety, privacy, dignity or protection than that provided by a cubicle curtain. So this is a real opportunity. Clearly, they cannot meet the recommendations in terms of physical distancing or other requirements addressing the COVID-19. So some of the real anxieties and the reality of this situation should really, I think, be a call to arms in terms of addressing this once and for all. They've no choice but to share bathroom accommodation and to live in a 2 metre by 2 metre bay, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Is this really an NHS fit for the 21st century? So to address this disparity would require investment in nearly 100 new wards across 23 mental health trusts and split roughly 2/3 adult acute to 1/3 older adult, and that excludes forensic services. It's nearly 20 years since the 100% single bedroom target was set across the NHS estate for mental health inpatient services. So in my view, it is absolutely time to press that reset button. Next, the environment and thinking strategically. We know the environmental cost of the NHS. We know that they now have a target net zero, and we're waiting for the issue of the roadmap to achieve that. We know the carbon footprint of the construction industry is significant. So this is a real opportunity to contribute to that green economic work and social reset advocated by the World Health Economic Forum last week. and combine that with national and local responses. So we know that some small changes or known changes will have a significant impact nationally, and we cannot go back to the way we were. So just locally for me, the impact in 11 weeks on the quality of the air in Oxford city centre is 65% reduction. That's just in Oxford alone. And as in the words of one of the local councillors there, it was World Environment Day last Friday, this is a real opportunity to look at things holistically and really forge a better future globally, but also in the mental health care environment. Next, this is an opportunity to really promote a national mental health investment building programme and to speed up capital project delivery. So now is the time, as part of that great reset to develop strategically and to build smart. The Health Infrastructure Plan launched last autumn with its headlines of 2.7 billion to rebuild 6 hospitals from now until 2025 and £100 million worth of seed funding for up to 34 additional hospitals from 2025 to 2035. There's also a rolling 5-year programme for further investment as part of a future capital review and a commitment to make the capital regime less bureaucratic. You may ask how many mental health trusts were amongst those lucky few for their shiny new build hospitals. If I told you it's precisely 1 out of the 27, and I understand that is a focus more on community hospitals, not mental health, perhaps people would sit up and take note. We have been promised pre-COVID that HIP3, the third wave, would have a focus on mental health, but it is simply not acceptable to wait until 2035 to have that investment or that commitment. The timescales of the HIP programme will not meet what we need to do in mental health and the mental health infrastructure needs. We would need the equivalent of 2 of the HIP schemes, whether they're phase 1 or phase 2, for circa 1.2 to 1.5 billion pounds worth, 7.4 to 8% of the whole programme, to actually eliminate dormitory style accommodation completely within mental health environments in England. So smarter briefing, design and construction is certainly something and an area that's being promoted by the Procure framework at the moment and will form part of P2020 moving forward. These schemes really do need to be delivered in the next 3 to 5 years. So we need to speed up what we do and focus on a more efficient and lean process in terms of not only the briefing and design, but also the approvals process through the central parties and bodies. So I know it's quite a lot to take on board in terms of my top 10. The others really, I think, hopefully speak to themselves. We're all, as everyone's heard, making better use of everyone's time, reassessing our daily lives and how we better input in terms of our working lives. We need to make sure that digital doesn't actually increase and enhance inequalities, and we've seen this already in education and in health. You know, video conferencing and e-consultations are great, but if you're elderly, hard of hearing or confused, then you're going to become more isolated and have less access to the urgent health services that you need. And then the last 2, I really do have a problem with this word social distancing. It's absolutely about physical distancing in terms of the health environment. And what we're trying to avoid is the negative impact that social distancing is having currently and will have in the future, which will then lead to greater demand on mental health services. And lastly, as a result, I guess, of a very tragic suicide, if you can be anything in this world, I think the be kind message is an absolutely key one. So if we're all a little kinder and care a little more out of this crisis, I think we will have absolutely taken the opportunity that has come out of this adversity. Thank you. I will now.
Thank you, Rosemary. Some really significant points in there. Still can't believe that only 1 out of 27 of the schemes is mental health related, and there's often talk about parity. So a kind of symbol highlight to how far we still have to travel. Now we've had some technical challenges today, so I am being the slide switcher for Mark. Mark, are you on the phone?
Can you hear me,
now?
everybody?
We have you. Technology is working on our side, so yes, let me know when you want me to switch the slide. I'm here and waiting, and I'll go back on mute now.
That's
so
great.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you very much, Philip. Good afternoon, everybody. Mark Carter from Ryder Architecture. I've been involved in design for mental health, similar to Rosemary, for 25 years now. And it's been an interesting challenge, I think, recently in terms of how we've had to adapt in terms of meeting clients, gathering briefs, stakeholder engagement, and then delivering projects. So Rosemary's covered sort of strategic issues, and I'd like to just concentrate on a little bit more of the detail going forward in how we do engage to enable design under such situations, and also what we are looking for in terms of finished products that are COVID safe at the end of the day. So as Philip said, I'm coming in via telephone, so apologies if there's a little bit of a hiccup, but Rosemary mentioned isolations via ability to use iPads and technology, so I'm kind of technologically inhibited today, but please bear with me. So yes, design in mental health sector resilience. So moving to my first slide, as I mentioned, the key for us at the moment has been to try and employ alternative methods for maintaining briefer and stakeholder engagement. And I think by and large, I can say that we've been quite successful by switching to new techniques. Obviously, when we go through design processes and briefing processes, we like to have a very structured engagement process. We believe in Ryder at a very collaborative approach in terms of working. And that includes developing a brief. And normally that involves getting around the table, having lots of workshops, identifying people that need to attend, and identifying roles and responsibilities to make decisions as we go through. It's usually an iterative process, so we come with ideas and we discuss those, we go away, and we come back with sort of revised ideas and plans. But obviously that's not so possible under the current situation. Now we have found that we can meet this way. We can come together through all the different platforms that are available to us, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, etc., and have digital meetings and interactions that way. But one of the key difficulties that we've found has been that actually a lot of the frontline clinical staff, the key people that we need to try and engage with, are obviously undertaking very serious other actions at the moment in terms of dealing with the crises that they've got on the wards and within their facilities. So it has been difficult in different circumstances to try and get hold of these people. So obviously, understandably, we're trying to still engage with them, but in a way that they are able to contribute in their own time. So how can we do that? I mean, in terms of resilience for this process, we've looked at stakeholder engagement through issue of information and producing presentations to describe those packs of information that we want to consult upon, whether that be layout plans or whether that be room loading at 1 to 50, looking at the detail of what goes in every space, or even a sanitary wear or a door schedule. So we've tried to make things as visual as possible, put those into a presentation, video record that, and then some of the trusts that we've been working with, Camden Islington in particular, have been very good in terms of creating a website platform where all that information can be loaded and people can view that at their own leisure. And just to help guide people through that, as I say, we've done video presentations, but we've also produced question and answer sheets where people can be prompted as to the key things we want them to look at and respond to. And those question and answers have then been collated through the website and through the trust into feedback. As you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, feedback which is graphic, representational of people's responses, whether that's positive or negative. We've tried to answer a sort of yes/no question. And then I think it's just how you liaise with different clients and trusts as to whether you say, well, should we take 70% agreement to that as the way forward and we don't need to make changes, and anything else that's below that or sort of 60% or below, perhaps we should come back with a further question for clarification. So it's a way to enable us to continue to design whilst getting feedback without the sort of face-to-face iterative process that we would normally go through. I mean, I think there are other aspects. On the left-hand side is the sort of day in the life exercise that we quite often do, where we sit around a table and it's very active. So I think we will have to think quite cleverly around other means of doing these sorts of exercises where you're testing, developing plans against operational policies. But certainly you can use technology to still consult and to get feedback. So that was the first point. The other points going forward, the second slide, consider separating service users into COVID-19 and non-COVID-19 wards. Now, obviously, that's very dependent on the different amounts of service users that you have within the building, in the facility, whether this is existing to adapt to COVID-19 or looking forward to the future to build in flexibility and that sort of robustness within designs to deal with COVID-19. Obviously, if you have enough patient groups and enough wards, you may be able to then split wards into COVID and non-COVID completely, the whole ward. But obviously then you have other considerations such as entrances, reception points, waiting areas, and the flow, the footfall in and out, the pathways in and out of those ward areas, whether that be service users themselves, whether it be visitors, or whether it be servicing and sort of FM of those areas. So careful consideration of those pathways would need to be undertaken. I'm just using slide images here which represent some of the projects we've worked on or are working on. So the one on the left is the CAMS unit in Bodmin in Cornwall, which has a very nice reception area and a sort of route through to the wards. And then there's the cafe on the left-hand side, in which service users can come from the wards and access the cafe for meeting family and friends, like a sort of family visiting area. So with some careful thought, you could create two routes by using these different accesses, one for COVID sort of safe route and one for non-COVID, which would be able, that would enable you to then create different sort of safe and separated routes into those ward areas. The little image on the left is Camden Islington inpatient facility, still at design stage. But again, we do have routes, as you can see in the yellow corridors there. One takes you into tribunal area and through to a vertical court, and the one is more direct. So you might just split that as two ways into the building and just have to consider those sorts of means of keeping separation. On the next slide, I've said if you can't obviously separate into whole wards, then maybe you could look at taking a ward and seeing how it would split down separately into COVID-19 and non-COVID-19 areas. And I think obviously all of us that work in mental health, we appreciate the sort of tried and tested designs and layout plans where you do group different service users separately, whether that be according to gender or different acuity or whatever within a ward. And we have moved towards sort of a lot of bedroom cluster designs. And that might be a way forward going forward that we need to consider more, because it creates that flexibility of how you separate service users within a ward. And we didn't think that service user separation through COVID-19 or infection would be one of those reasons to separate. But I think the cluster model does give you good ability to do that. The plan on the left shows again the Cornwall CAMS in Bodmin, which we designed into three clusters for the main residential areas. So you've got a high dependency unit, 2 bedrooms with its own lounge and garden. And then the other bedrooms are arranged into 2 clusters of 6 beds, each with their own little sitting room and their own access to a courtyard garden. And the image on the left is one of those little sitting rooms. So instantly you've got a house with the key facilities that you need to provide in terms of sleeping, ensuite accommodation, as Rosemary mentioned at the start. This is obviously looking towards single and suite bedroom accommodation. And you can provide the facilities for eating, maybe for lounge and exercise within that cluster. And then that would enable you to separate out completely. And taking the second point, you would obviously need to look at operational policies to go along with that. So maybe bringing meals to that little sitting room. It's only 6 people, if you can manage that. That people can eat within that space. and then they would have to come out to use the other areas separately, but in a more sort of restricted fashion, I suppose, but actually timed fashion into how they access the joint spaces. But creating these two clusters or several clusters of operation would enable you to do that. Providing space within common areas. So if you've managed to create separation for key clusters of sleeping, dining and sort of lounge facilities, what about other areas? So people having to come out to use drug dispensing treatment rooms, coming out to use activity spaces. And I think it's about how you look at those spaces, and is there the ability, first of all, to separate those spaces out? So some of the images at the bottom left, which is cams again, we've got a dining area and a lounge area and sort of quiet space all in a large open plan area. Is there the ability to create social distancing within that space? Is there the ability to separate those spaces and only make them usable by certain groups at certain times? The second image is the little activity room, which was designed as a sort of a snug in the CAMS unit. That again could be used for other functions. So maybe the original function of the room would need to be looked at, and you create multi-purpose functions or spaces different to what they were originally designed for, but you're enabling the same group of activities within one space, but you've then got that space repeated to keep people separate. And then outside space, very important. Have you got enough outside spaces, whether it be open courtyards or the horticultural garden areas? If you had those spaces, you may be looking at treating those differently, and again having all of the functions within the one space, but again using the different spaces to separate people. So I think through booking systems, you might have to look at how you access those spaces and keep the occupancy levels down within those shared areas, and giving the ability to physical distance, as Rosemary said, rather than social distance. We obviously want social interaction in many ways, but not the physical connectivity. And I think if you can achieve that, obviously there would need to be sort of educational programs alongside this, just to explain to the service users why the day is different to normal, why they are having to do this, and why they can't access spaces or have the freedom that they normally would do. Because I guess what we're trying to do normally in a mental health facility is create as normalised environment as possible. But interestingly, Rosemary said at the beginning, what is normal? What is the new normal? So maybe we're creating a new normalised environment where there is some form of isolation. But it's just understanding that and making sure everyone that's having to deal with that understands the process and what they can and can't do, as is the case for everybody at the moment. Obviously, infection control is a big part of our design consideration when we go through designing buildings. But I think, obviously, at the moment, that has a different connotation and a higher implication in terms of looking at detail. So when we go through looking at fixed furniture, finishes, etc., we do look at that in a lot of detail. But I think it's just working more closely with infection control officers, with trusts, looking at the COVID-19 issues and trying to create environments that have still got the feel of a therapeutic environment, that are not too clinical, but have got the right level of cleaning and maintenance in terms of their hygiene. So reception desks, starting at the reception desk when you come in, use of sort of 3-colour materials and that sort of thing, like a Corin or something similar. Floor finishes, obviously with vinyl floorings and coved skirtings, enabling cleaning regimes to be maintained. The middle image is something we're developing for fixed furniture, for sort of TV areas and lounge areas. So looking at your materials and specifications, trying to maintain an element that is still maybe got some warmth to it, as I say, not too clinical and looks more homely, but still has that infection control requirement. And then the last image there is something we did for Kenton Medway, which is a vinyl wallpaper, which actually is the ability to put art into areas without creating dust traps or areas where infection control is going to be compromised. So doing sort of design and creating artwork within the wallpaper. It's a vinyl washable wallpaper that can go up, very easily cleanable, and you create a bit of art and interest within the space without, as I say, inhibiting the infection control regime. And then I suppose, just as everywhere is doing at the moment, whether it's trains or whatever, it's looking at the rigorous, this is more sort of an operational policy aspect, looking at your rigor in terms of your cleaning regime, but just making sure that we're working through in terms of the design to ensure that the strategies for maintenance and cleaning are supported by the specifications that we're choosing. And then I think finally the last slide is around a couple of things that we've discussed on a project recently, which was for the older adults. So in older adult mental health, obviously there's been an horrific impact in care homes from the COVID-19 pandemic. And one of the issues that we've investigated is, would you be able to provide medical gases within an older adult mental health facility, which would at least mean that you could keep the service users, should they fall ill, in their own environment, not have to transfer them to a hospital perhaps, depending on how ill they get, obviously. But there would be a potential there to try and maintain a relative sort of normal environment for the people, but give them what they need in terms of some support. So I think it's looking around how that would be achievable in a mental health environment, trying to again declinicalize it. I've put some images which are obviously acute health settings, but are there ways of looking at coverings or panels that maybe hide those medical gases, which would normally be a ligature point and a risk, but in the event of someone needing them, you could take off a concealed panel and reveal the gases perhaps, but try and incorporate them within a decor that is more normalised and homely rather than a clinical setting. And then the final one is enhanced hand washing facilities. I mean, typically in mental health facilities, because we are looking at single ensuite bedroom accommodation where you have all of your own facilities, that is usually enough provision, but we may need to consider going forward putting in more hand wash facilities. Obviously, there are issues around alcohol gels within mental health, so maybe more wash hand basins along corridors, as long as they're put in spaces that are highly observable and controlled, and don't cause a ligature risk, using the resin molded wave on wave off type. You might be able to create more around making sure people are washing their hands frequently. That and a lot of signage obviously around distancing and maintaining those good hygiene standards, I think would be a given. But I think they're my key points, and yes, look forward to any questions that anyone might have. Thank you, Philip.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for that. Some really interesting points again there with how we can use perhaps what historically would have been gender flexibility between male and female segregation to be adopted for COVID flexibility. It'll be interesting to see how that rolls out over the coming months and perhaps years. So I'm going to pick up here with the final presentation. I've kind of perhaps taken a bit more of a generalist view if my voice actually survives the next bit. And this is just really about my top 10 tips for resilience in adversity. As I mentioned at the top, 2020 is proving to be quite an interesting year. And it looks like this new normal is going to continue on for quite some time. To me, resilience is about the strength to be able to cope in these challenging times. Not necessarily about not getting knocked down, but when we do get knocked down, being strong enough to get back up. And so here are my top 10. So I think one of the first ones I've picked up on is focus on your cause. When we first set up the company, our vision at the time was about making people's lives better. Both me and my business partner studied product design together, and this was a kind of real passion of ours. As things have evolved, things have developed further, and one of the earlier exercises we did with the full team here was actually just really kind of get everybody together to focus in on what is our purpose, what gets us out of bed. And this was the kind of quite simple statement that the team came up with. And we haven't just stopped there. We're in the process of looking at our values again, just kind of getting that clarity. And I think it's a kind of really powerful thing when we are working remote. We're disconnected perhaps physically from each other. How do we keep that social connection? And I think kind of a common reason for getting out of bed is a really powerful one. One of the next points here is, staying connected. For the past 12 years since setting up the company, I've traveled the length and breadth of the country. And I think my longest counted number of days that I wasn't, or that I was at home was 8 days. And I've got a ticker that's on my desk and it's now sitting at 89 days today. So I'm doing far less travel. But I have to say, I've never felt more connected to both with the team and with customers. And, you've heard a lot today talking about design teams, the collaboration platforms that are people being used. I actually see it as kind of one of the big strengths that's coming off the back of this is the ability to be even closer to each other. As a company, we've always been geographically spread. We've got, where we started at SafeEng in Glasgow, and we've got Primera in Blackpool. But actually, we have a whole team who are geographically dotted across the country. Our intention there being always, let's stay close to people, making sure that we can support them. And even within that, there's many challenges. It's one of the things that I found quite distinct about COVID is the same issue has presented to individuals in very different ways, and there's maybe themes that we can learn there from considering how people react to mental health environments, so on. I've got examples where people living by themselves and they're just simply missing other people's company, and then you've got the families, those who are living with families and lots of small kids and trying to work at the same time, and they're desperate for some peace and quiet. One of our team does have 2 young twins, so I can imagine the size of the challenge that he is facing. But either way, we focused on using video platforms to stay in touch, and we've also hosted a series of webinars and had great attendance like we are here, where people are keen just to learn even when they're afar. And as a team, again, one of the things with this work from home regime, there's very significant challenges. How do we still keep active and not just move from our, home office, which might be the sofa, to then the TV the TV session in the evening, again being on the sofa. So one of our engineers featured here at the top was Matt, and he decided to give us a whole challenge where the company would split into 2 parts, and we would have an exercise race across the entire country. So we're currently challenging ourselves by traveling the distance. I think one team is in Carlisle and the other is in Glasgow just now. And we've got cycling, running, walking, and you can even see here, Chris, one of our team, decided to do a bit of freshwater swimming. Now, believe it or not, that was in Scotland. And it does get sunny there every now and then. So, yes, stranger things can happen. And the next is being brave. We've had a lot of talk amongst the wider society about the braveness of our key workers, both within the NHS and wider supporting roles. We've experienced that ourselves. So in the past year, we've moved into doing more and more installation work, adding COVID into the mix. And particularly in the early days, this was actually quite frightening for a number of the team. So we've been lucky enough to have a team who recognise the life-saving role of our products that they play in mental health facilities and the importance of it. So we've had to kind of work together to spend a lot of time listening and speaking to them, understanding their concerns, but also then thinking about how will we address those concerns? How can we mitigate the risk? And is there certain situations where it's just actually not safe to work? And we've had huge support from the ward teams that we've been working with. This was Chris, who was doing a survey at an accident and emergency award. It was for a place of safety. within an A&E environment, and it was what they called the hot side, which I think was their definition of somewhere where there was high levels of people with COVID. And so this was him getting dressed up in scrubs, working with the local teams to, again, ensure that he's not bringing any risk of infections, but also keeping himself safe as well. Always being here to help. Again, we recognise the challenging environments that we're in, and the importance of the role. During the earlier stages, there was a period when I think the furlough scheme first came into play, and there was a number of our supply chain partners who entered into the hibernation mode, feeling that there wasn't enough activity to keep going. Obviously, for the products that we provide, we still had demand, and actually some people were looking for rapid delivery and rapid turnaround in context of creating COVID-safe spaces. So we had to work very heavily with our supply chain, engaging with a number of them to bring them back online. And as much of that was about actually extending and sharing with them the importance of what we do, and the impact it has on the estates, architects and clinical teams. We've also been carrying out a lot of our technical support remotely. In actual fact, one of the things we did earlier on was offering free of charge remote technical support. We've been using WhatsApp video, all sorts of things to communicate with people, even when they're just only using a mobile device. And it's really actually been a great thing. And like Rosemary said, when we go into this great reset, what are the key things we're going to take away? This kind of technical remote support allows us to provide really, really quick support. It's almost instant. And generally we're resolving issues within an hour or so of them being reported. Now, contrast that to being a call out to site, which there would be costs with, not to mention that it might take a day to get there. You can see actually a benefit here of being able to help much quicker. I'm picking up on Rosemary's point here about investing in mental health care. I'm still going to come back to that stat. 1 in 27 was mental health related. There's been various reports all around the world about the mental health crisis that will come off the back of COVID. I think in two major waves. There is the initial profound impact that COVID has had on people, isolated from friends and family, from work colleagues, their normal way of life being disrupted. But then we've also got to think about what the longer term economic impact of COVID will be, and will that create a second wave of mental health challenges? We're still with a significant reduction in patient beds for mental health facilities, and that's before we even consider Rosemary's point there about the circa 1,000 patients which are currently receiving their mental health care in communal dormitory bedrooms, and how that actually impacts their mental health recovery. And I think then amongst all of this, there's a kind of key drive for making sure that with these new environments that are coming along, perhaps we use a little bit of extra time here that we have for consideration and reflection on some of the key evidence that's out there. How are we going to create better environments? Speaking to more and more experts by experience. Again, when I mentioned earlier on this kind of enhanced connectivity through remote platforms, can we actually improve what we're doing? Can we spend the time researching the safety alerts, the National Confidential Suicide Inquiry within mental health environments? Can we delve into these in a deeper way than we've ever done before to make sure that all the products and the projects that we're designing are utilising best practice and evidence-led? And again, I'll always bang this drum. Having worked on this testing guidance for plus 5 years, I think it's more important than ever. We're in a reality of decisions are going to be made on projects largely remotely. And that's because we won't be able to facilitate the same face-to-face conversations that we've done for a long period of time. Historically, the decision or selection of a product has been very, very intense. Lots of face-to-face meetings and large groups of people touching, feeling, testing products themselves. But what if we have to move away from all of that? And I think, again, the testing guidance, which was published in the last few weeks and will hopefully open its doors for testing in the next couple of months, will be a really strong way where people can continue to make good decisions and informed improvements for their environments. And it only goes to highlight, I saw an email that was forwarded to me by an architect the other day where somebody was referencing that their product was ligature safe. And I had a conversation with the architect saying that's a very bold claim for someone to make such an absolute statement. What evidence have they provided to support it? And it turned out there was nothing. There was no TS001, which has its shortcomings, but is still the best testing regime we have for ligature performance. So I think this is going to be a really kind of profound step forward with these informed choices and really allow people to make good choices with their products going forward. Final point, final point is kindness. Now, I'm kind of maybe going to view this in a number of different ways. I think there has been an exceptional outpouring from various walks of life. The sense of community that we felt as we've all gone through the challenge, the clap for our carers at 8 p.m. on a Thursday evening. I know in my own neighbourhood, we've always kind of joined it and everybody's got out there, whether it be with clapping bare hands or getting the pots and pans to make even more noise. And enjoying the slightly slower pace of life. And even when it's not been slower, it's just probably been more productive. We're getting a little bit more time on things. Meetings sometimes last shorter periods of time so we can get more done, and leaving a little bit more time for evenings where you've got time with the family, maybe cooking for yourself. And, you know, before COVID kicked off, there was a lot of talk about climate change. We often push back of, no, we need to travel, we need to keep on doing those face-to-face meetings. So can we all be kind to ourselves and kind to the environment and think about what parts of the changes that we're currently seeing that we want to harness and continue? We've all made huge adjustments beyond what we ever thought was possible. Let's not just jump back to the way things were before. And then my actual final point is looking at the Black Lives Matters movement that started with just a few weeks back with the murder of George Floyd by the police in the US, but has grown to highlight much more significant and systemic racism that our world still suffers from. I chose to kind of have this as the final point because this is ultimately a position of privilege to be able to talk to many people. June is also Pride Month. The Stonewall riots celebrated their 50th anniversary last year. These riots were ultimately started by Black trans women in America. They were objecting to police brutality. So even today, as the Pride Marches continues, we still are looking at seeing the power of what has changed, but still how much work has to change. And to highlight that point, I read a pretty horrific statistic that the life expectancy of Black trans women is just 35 years old. Now, I'm saying these points in a wider context, not specifically related to mental health, but I think they still apply to that and to everything. I'm saying it from a point of let's pause for a moment and think about how we can make steps towards resolving the inequality that is amongst our world. There are many reports which point to companies and organizations that have more diversity as being more profitable, perhaps arguably more successful. I would also argue that being more diverse helps us become stronger and ultimately more resilient. And so my final takeaway point is for us all to just pause and reflect. As a business, as myself, I'm still thinking about what some of the recent protests actually mean. There's a lot of conversations that have been started internally within our company, and that's where we're going. We're just pausing, speaking to the team, and trying to understand what concrete actions we're going to take to make a fairer workplace. So that's me at the end of our presentation. We should have the 3 speakers back on play. So if I can ask the 3 speakers to all take their mute off, and I'll start asking a few questions. So one of the first things I'm going to do is a question that came in from Jenny. In the new normal, whatever that may be, there will be financial constraints in all walks of life. Do you think that savings can be made in design costs by the use of technology? And if they can, will they be swallowed up with an increase of areas in buildings for corridors, rooms, etc., and or construction costs if some forms of social distancing is still required? Rosemary, is this maybe one that you can pick up? I'm not sure if we've got Mark on the line.
Yep. Thanks, we have. I can see Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Oh, we have. We've got Mark joined. That's good. Well, we'll start with Rosemary, and then I'll come to you for the same question, if that's okay, Mark.
Great. Okay, can you hear me okay?
Sure,
we can, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. I think the first point is absolutely technology can save and offer better value, but it's not just in design. Design actually is a very small proportion of the total cost when it comes to construction costs, but actually that in itself is dwarfed when it comes to running costs. So I guess in direct response to Jenny's question is I think there will be much greater efficiencies in the delivery of mental health projects through standardization. So that delivers efficiencies both in terms of the design, the consultation and the construction stage. But I think there will also be the greater focus on the actual running costs, and comes into that the impact on the environment, which we will be able to model. We will be able to talk and engage in a 3D environment, in a 4D environment with users to make sure that we are absolutely optimizing the design, and also making sure that we are meeting the new requirements of staff as well as service users moving forward, because there's been a significant impact on staff across the NHS. It was already a challenge and a pressure point within mental health, and that has only got worse due to the COVID situation. So I think, yes, some of the facilities may become larger. Equally, they may become smaller in terms of the numbers of beds and the cohort of patients that we are grouping together within individual units.
Thank you, Rosemary. Mark, do you want to add to that at all? Or I've got another question that's actually been directed to you.
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
well, so just to quickly add, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Yes, no, we can.
Yeah, just to quickly add, I think I agree with Rosemary. Obviously, technology in terms of briefing process, design and communication, from the days when Rosemary and I both started on drawing boards, we've come a long way. And there's all sorts of techniques now which enable communication, 3D visualizations, fly-throughs, etc. QR codes to show room loading is all very positive. I think in terms of the question around can technology help in terms of the environment, I suppose it's about just enabling a normalized environment. So if we are relying more on technology generally as a society, then that will transfer into inpatient facilities. But I think it's about using technology to enable people to still have face-to-face contact, because there's nothing worse than technology taking over from personal interrelationships and what we all need from socialization. So I suppose it's about how we can benefit from that. I mean, we've been to some of these conferences where there's virtual reality headsets and all this sort of stuff, and I suppose it might play a role, but I don't think it will ever take over from being able to talk face to face with a colleague or a friend or a family member. And it's just how we enable that safely.
Yeah. And the next question we've got in is from Paul Marsh. Given the remote decision making required by trust and teams, and the increased risk of decision changes or changes in the operation at a later date, are you now designing with a further eye on future-proofing facilities?
Yeah, shall I take that? Carry on with that. So I think I mentioned flexibility at the start in terms of some of the design techniques, and I think we were talking about the cluster model and how traditionally that's been used for gender segregation, separation. And also we've used it in older adults, particularly facilities, because you can review the ability for personalised care, or whether it be functional or organic. But I think the more flexible a space can be used for whatever the need, and I suppose, as Rosemary said, in terms of smaller cohorts of people, maybe managing them, it's about providing flexible facilities, and I think that is whatever the need. It's just about how it can adapt with and it might not necessarily mean doubling up on spaces. It's just how you use them cleverly in design to create that flexibility.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. So I don't think we've had any more questions. Has anybody got any other comments? Rosemary, do you want to make any comment at all on that point?
I was just going to make one, which is around the needs of staff are changing. We heard earlier this morning from Rowan View in terms of actually they hadn't built in hot desking space for staff, and actually staff are working well. Those that don't need to be directly on the ward or directly engaged with service users can do part of their job role from home within a remote environment. So I think what we need to do is make sure that we don't lose sight of the requirements for staff. In terms of future-proofing, I do think there are a couple of areas that we will need to consider in terms of routes through and around new facilities, opportunities to sort of don off and don on of PPE moving forward, and just new ways of working really to make sure that we are exposing our staff to the least possible risk within what's already a high pressure environment.
Yes, yeah, and one of the things that I've come across quite a few times is concerns and questions about what the interaction is for patients in view of PPE. I don't know whether there'll be a new normalised expectation of PPE, and whether actually the design of PPE will become more normalised with that as well, but time will tell on that front. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Rosemary and Mark. We might all be wearing PPE all the time. Let's hope not, but yeah.
Maybe that's a new innovation. You can have a clear PPE face mask where you can actually see someone's mouth while they're talking.
Yeah.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, no,
you can see them tomorrow.
Yeah, well, they had in the earlier days they had name badges. Sorry, go Mark.
Sorry, I think there's a bit of delay on mine. Yes, obviously my focus was around inpatient facility, but I think also for outpatient facilities in terms of mental health community services, that's a very valid one. And I think Rosemary's point around staff is very valid, because obviously there are different challenges. Obviously in an inpatient facility, you can control that environment much more. But an outpatient, you've got people coming in and out and potential to bring infection in. So I think there's a whole set of design considerations that need to be factored in there as well. And that might be more around operational policy and testing regimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a valid point. There has been one last question come in, so I'll ask this quickly to all. Rosemary, perhaps you can kick us off. What one or two changes will you be making to your working days post-COVID?
Well, I guess we've already made changes to our working days during COVID, and who knows when post-COVID will be. So I guess the first one is successfully facilitating workshops with multiple users using the technology that we have available. So obviously there's a momentum that's taking place with the existing projects, and it's important that that's maintained. Certainly COVID-19 is no barrier to undertaking workshops, and I've recently facilitated a design appraisal toolkit workshop for a team in Manchester from the comfort of my chair in Oxfordshire, and we had really good engagement using the full range of online polls, so that there was feedback and dialogue during that discussion. So I guess that's the greatest change. The second one, I think we've probably already alluded to, is making sure that decisions that are taken are strategic and they're smart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Mark?
For me personally, I think it'd be trying to get 2 walks a day in and keeping that going. That's going to be difficult. But I think obviously the lessons are around making sure that we are only travelling when we need to be, I suppose. I think we've all proved that we can manage to not only brief a project but design a project remotely. We need the social contact, but I think if we can be more efficient in how we use our time, which is a lesson learned to go forward with, I think collaborative project working is key, and it's how you do that, whether it's through technology or face to face. But it's a balance, I suppose, that would give you the optimum.
Yeah, and I'll add my own few ones because they're much in line with the rest of what you're saying. Is certainly efficiency of not having to travel everywhere, and actually sometimes creating enhanced connectivity. Like Rosemary said, online polls have been a really, really good addition that work alongside these kind of virtual meetings. So you can have 50, 60 people, but all interacting and all making their voice heard, sometimes being more vocal than when they would be when they're face to face. So that's probably one side of it. And then I think actually the other big thing that we see as appeal is because these meetings happen virtually, they can be recorded very easily and then actually shared very easily. We used to really have a huge battle of engaging with, say, the 10 or 20 people spread across an NHS trust who all really needed to attend a meeting and get their opinion heard. But when we record the session, then being able to share that, they can still take part in a poll after the session has ended. So again, people can actually, much like we watch TV, we use iPlayer or we use Netflix, and it's on demand. So how can we actually help people who are juggling various shift patterns and so on to take part in the design process in a similar way as well, and that can be digested when they've got the time to digest. We have actually got one last question, which we'll make the last.
A very good... Okay.
Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to add to that, Philip. I think your point about people maybe contributing more than they would normally, I think is a really good one, because I think the one thing that this has done is it puts everyone on an equal footing. So we're all sort of individually represented rather than going to people's offices, or particularly for service users or other people or stakeholders coming into a room where it's being managed and they're guests. Whereas I think with this kind of thing, everyone has an equal footing and platform on which they're talking. So I think it does actually encourage people's voices to be heard greater than in a normal scenario, which is an interesting point.
Yeah, there's definitely positives from it. And then the last question came from Morag Lee. I know Morag's all the way in Perth, so I'm not quite sure what time it is there, but this might be with a late night cup of tea. Asking a question about how about isolation rooms within mental health wards. Has there been any discussions of this? So perhaps if I can throw that to both Rosemary and Mark. I suppose one of the questions I've got alongside this is I know there's some restrictions to how long somebody can be put in seclusion rooms, and I don't know whether anybody's aware whether there's any similar rules for perhaps isolation rooms or how people are addressing that from a design point of view.
I think it's Rosemary. I think you need to be really clear about defining isolation. It has many meanings and connotations, and certainly in the acute sector, there are quite stringent requirements in terms of the ventilation strategies, the additional space required in terms of lobbies and support, as well as medical gases and the like. So I think we have to be really careful about making sure that we are treating the patient or the service user in the most appropriate environment, and not putting them at any greater risk by keeping them in one facility where actually they may be better treated and better cared for in another one. So I think we need to be really careful about what can and can't be achieved within existing mental health settings, and then there needs to be dialogue during design stage. There's a great sort of tendency for a knee-jerk reaction and for over-engineering or over-providing in response to a particular situation that's happening that may not be the best for that project moving forward.
Yep, and I would agree that I think Rosemary's right. I mean, isolation in terms of an acute setting is a physical isolation to stop the spread of infection, whereas that has different connotations in mental health settings. So if you need it for that purpose, then it would need the negative ventilation and a lobby. But you do have seclusion, you do have de-escalation, high dependency areas within wards, which are more about segregation via sort of acuity or issues of that kind, rather than anything from transmitting an infectious disease point of view. So it would have to be defined as to why, if you needed an isolation room from an infection control point of view, then I suppose you would just have a standard bedroom, but make sure it's got the separate ventilation and lobby issues.
Okay, that's great. Thank you both again. Well, that's us out of all our questions. So I'm probably going to call our time because we're past the hour. But a huge thank you to you both, and thank you to everybody who's listened and taken part with their questions as well. So have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Philip. Thanks, Rosemary.
Thanks,
Good
guys.
to see you.
Likewise.